You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
There is a basic racism in this country, which exists. And it's contrary to some of our basic concepts as expressed in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and other documents. In these documents, we find that there is a contradiction. Some of those people who express the strong position on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, will be some of those who are prone to express themselves forcefully on discrimination, and to try to justify this by twisting the concepts of the Constitution.
Byron Rumford's story is important because fewer than 3,800 individuals going back to 1849 have ever sat in this chamber and voted on public policy. Byron Rumford was one of those individuals.
How, coming out of the South, could a black man living in a city where that was white, except our basic community, expect to get elected?
And quite frankly, Byron Rumford, as a man of equal stature to other legislators who was able to speak his mind and quite frankly take on challenging issues of race and injustice, really gave people a sense of possibility in California.
When it comes to significant legislation in the history of this state, I would not know of any legislature who achieved the number and the significance of passage of bills than Byron Rumford.
He came first with a bill that would guarantee fair employment practices for the state of California. And so from a racial standpoint, he kind of tuned in that, we're being prohibited from living where we'd like or renting an apartment where we would like. So that's when he looked at housing.
His fair housing legislation opened the way for a California Supreme Court decision and for a U.S. Supreme Court decision. And that U.S. Supreme Court decision, of course, was valid in all other states, in addition to California, everywhere.
My dad grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, went to an all-black high school, and as he was in high school, he worked in a pharmacy. And that's when he got interested in the drugstore business. His father had abandoned the family early on in Arizona, and he felt that he wanted to continue his education, so he left Phoenix, Arizona and came to California. And he came to Sacramento, went to Sacramento to go to junior college, but he had to pay for it by working on the railroads. He spent a lot of time on the railroads earning the money to go to college, with the idea in mind to go to the University of California School of Pharmacy in San Francisco. Politics really wasn't on his mind at that time. It was getting an education and getting a job. This was the time in the Great Depression, and he finished college during the Depression, and of course married my mother in 1932. Mom, Elsie Rebecca Rumford, born and raised in Oakland, went to Oakland Tech, and even through the Depression, she and her sisters worked really hard, put themselves through San Francisco State Teachers College, getting their credentials. But my mother never taught public school. In the 1930s, after he graduated from pharmacy school, he had to take a test for a state license. And he was able to take the test for the pharmacy license. He also was trying to get over to Highland Hospital in Oakland, and there was resistance to hiring him at that time.
My father used to frequently talk about how hard it was to get hired at Highland Hospital and how hard it was for black people to get jobs, period. He had to go back continually for interviews. They'd ask him silly questions like, what do you think of Joe Louis?
Questions that he had nothing to do with a pharmacy license.
He could never pass that oral interview. They just didn't want to hire him. They said, oh, this is going to not be good for the hospital. I don't know how it's going to work. And he just said, give me a chance.
So he was the first black professional hired at Highland Hospital. And he worked there and also took a job in Berkeley in a neighborhood drugstore at night.
Berkeley was a strong and vibrant community. The city council is made up of basically business people. It is mostly an idyllic, conservative, WASP community.
And during this time, my dad bought the small pharmacy in Berkeley on Sacramento Street.
It was Dick's Pharmacy. It was owned by a white pharmacist, and he worked there for a long time, and that's how we got to know him. And then, of course, the smartest thing in the world was that when Dick retired, the wonderful thing is he allowed Byron to buy his business. So he bought that drugstore from Dick's Pharmacy, and it became Rumford's Pharmacy.
And then he built his own store across the street. And so he was doing well, feeding his family, taking care of us. And at that point in time, there was a tremendous migration of people coming in from the South to work in the shipyards.
The reason we as black people, any number of us, and why there was a black community that developed in South Berkeley was because the Japanese had been taken off and put in internment camps. If you wanted to own your own home, you were drawn to Berkeley where there was plenty of housing because there had been a large Japanese community that had owned their homes. So this became a focal point that if you wanted to live outside of the projects where many of us had lived up to then, and you wanted to become a homeowner, you wanted to have a life that was measurably better than that one that you'd come from in the South, then this was the place to want to be.
A lot of these people came, blacks and whites from the South, with little or no skills until they got to the shipyards where they learned to weld these boats together. And of course, the struggle for jobs after the war was the big problem. The unions wouldn't let you in to get a union card. I'm talking about the plumbers, the electricians.
It didn't matter how much money you had, how intelligent you were. If your skin was brown, opportunity was denied.
Berkeley was a segregated community in every way you can imagine. All the black folks in Berkeley lived in South or West Berkeley. They had all the covenants for restrictive housing and certainly discrimination in employment. And quite frankly, Sacramento Street was really the line. There were very few blacks who lived above Sacramento Street, and none lived above Shattuck. And a lot of people, until they were confronted with the reality of racism and economic oppression, refused to admit that it even existed. And California didn't recognize itself as racist in any way, but certainly it was. There was basically no black representation in Northern California.
From 1849 to 1918, no African Americans had ever been elected to the California State Assembly or the State Senate. Frederick Roberts was the first African American elected official elected to the California legislature. He was elected in 1918.
Now, Frederick Roberts, who was a Republican, was the great-great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson. And his great-great-grandmother, of course, was Sally Hemings. And he introduced in 1918 the very first Civil Rights Act in the state of California, and probably the country.
And when Frederick Roberts was elected to the California State Assembly, he was treated differently than his colleagues that were serving in the legislature. Frederick Roberts could not stay at the Senator Hotel across the street from the California legislature because the laws in effect allowed the hotel operators to discriminate based on race. And Frederick Roberts would board or stay with the families of African Americans in the Sacramento area whenever he would come to Sacramento for the legislative sessions. And in 1934, he was replaced by Gus Hawkins, who was elected from the Los Angeles area. And the Honorable Gus Hawkins had defeated Frederick Roberts in a contested race.
Well, if you had seen Gus Hawkins, say, on Wilshire Boulevard, you would know that he was one of us, because he was very, very light-skinned and could pass if he wanted to.
So the struggle began then, and there were many people in West Oakland, Berkeley, who were very assertive in trying to break into the political world.
D.G. Gibson is really the father of black politics in the East Bay.
D.G. Gibson was a businessman in Berkeley. He had newspapers brought in from around the country, Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, Louisiana Weekly. All of those he got and then distributed. And of course, through that process, he and my dad became very good friends.
He was very low profile. He never had to be the head of the group. But he was a political genius. He would have been really what we call hell on wheels in Washington.
He was a strategist. He made sure that he was a behind-the-scenes man. He pushed other people to the front. He made sure that people got into where decisions were being made.
My business was a public stenography business, and my two first clients were Byron Rumford and Tom Berkeley. Tom Berkeley let me put my office up in the base of his building. Tom Berkeley was supposed to be the first assemblyman at the legislature. Something happened, I don't know what meeting it happened at, but then Tom backed out, and they said, well, then let's just go with Byron Rumford.
I don't think Dad really had any personal desires to run for public office, but the community meetings resulted in him being drafted to run for the Assembly District. And the 1948 general election, he was elected. There were discrepancies in the ballots. Some were found in the alleyways of Berkeley. At that point in time, it was a position of cross-filing. You could put up your name on the Republican ballot as well as the Democratic ballot. And for quite some time, Dad was elected on both ballots. He was respected by the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party, and then that was changed some years later. And that started his political career in the 17th Assembly District.
And I think a lot of people are very proud that there was black elected leadership in California and representing Berkeley and West Oakland.
In the late 40s, West Oakland had a very high concentration of blacks. Things were segregated then, and West Oakland at the time was at least 70% African American. There were a lot of black businesses, real estate offices, barber shops, beauty salons, restaurants, nightclubs. Almost any kind of day-to-day business existed at that time in West Oakland, in that perimeter between Wood and Adeline.
And so Byron was the first political person of color to make a difference both in West Oakland and Berkeley.
It was kind of interesting because Dad being elected to public office at that time was his ability to attract people into the pharmacy for various things, black products. But more importantly, that came time for an election, whether it was a state, federal, or city election, he would take a sample ballot, post it in the window of the pharmacy, and people would come by to see who Rumford was suggesting they vote for.
As 7th Street was to West Oakland, Sacramento Street was to Berkeley.
The black community is pretty self-contained in terms of services, and that area around Ashby Avenue in Sacramento was really the center of black economic activity and business in Berkeley.
My dad really did enjoy having his business right on the main corridor of the black business community. We lived on that same street as the drugstore. Also, I think he loved the university. because he went back and got his master's degree at Cal, and he loved being a part of the university grads. He loved football and would take me to some of the football games at Cal. He followed the football. He loved basketball. You know, he used to be a boxer when he was young, and he really enjoyed sports a lot. My parents were very social, both of them actually. Constantly going to meetings, social events, dinners, banquets. It was busy all the time. My mother was always interested in politics and what was happening. She took, of course, a lesser role than my father, but she would be a part of that conversation.
We idolized them as a couple because we knew that they loved us. They cared about us. And his wife, Elsie, was the greatest helpmate you would ever see in a woman. She was right there by his side.
Mom was quite active in various activities. There was the NAACP and the sorority, the links, other social functions. She was running the drugstore in terms of doing the books and the banking and payroll and so forth.
One of the things that always stuck with me about the drugstore was it was a place where he could help people who were sick. And when the delivery boy didn't show up one time, I guess he was ill or something, my father would deliver medicine after he closed the store, deliver medicine to all the people that needed it.
My father was chairman of the Public Health Committee for 16 years in Sacramento and was responsible for a lot of legislation, including the Good Samaritan Act, where a doctor does not get sued at the scene of an accident.
And that was very important to physicians so that they would feel free to help people on the spot. When I grew up, a lot of kids still had polio, and my father had the first bill which gave the first oral vaccine free to children so that they would not get polio.
Dad was responsible for the taxes taken off of prescription items, on and on.
And he worked with the doctors, he worked with the pharmacists, he worked with chiropractors and others to make sure that, quite frankly, quality health and availability of health was a forthright and, quite frankly, challenging part of public policy.
He wrote his master's thesis at the University of California in political science on smog issues in California.
Smog was one of the issues that really was contaminating our environment. And you know, here in Los Angeles, we lived in areas where the air was polluted. So we watched what was going on. And usually when some major change that would affect our entire population was made here in California, the other states started to follow.
Health issues were of primary importance to him, but then other issues. And he was responsible for eliminating discrimination in hiring at the National Guard level. And these things were not just for the black community per se, but for the people of California as a whole.
Byron Rumford was ahead of his time. There was no black caucus to second his motion. He had to go across the aisle if he was going to be effective. And Rumford really is an excellent illustration and example of what it means to be effective.
The most devastating moment for Byron Rumford, as I knew him, was the death of his youngest son, Randolph. We called him Randy.
It was very difficult for my mom and dad when my brother Randy, when he drowned. He was 21 years old.
Very pleasant young man who was drowned while swimming with some friends after returning from his service in the Army.
It was this accidental drowning on the 4th of July, and my father and mother were both very sad for a long time. Things changed around the house because usually they were both kind of upbeat people, very happy people, very positive kind of people.
So I knew that he was very emotionally hurt by it and couldn't speak about it for quite some time. And you could imagine as a father losing a son in which you held a lot of promise, pretty destructive to him.
Yeah, as you can imagine, the loss of a child is very sad.
The move among black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party really started with Franklin Roosevelt. Then there was a period where Eisenhower was president and he was not enthusiastic about supporting or enforcing the decisions of the Supreme Court on civil rights, and the shift was clearly happening.
In the late 50s, early 60s, public accommodations was not in effect in those early times. And of course, here in the state capitol, here in Sacramento, the Capitol Press would not allow any African American or non-daily newspapers, they called them, to really serve the Capitol. So we had a tough time finding and getting news. We had to get it from our own sources. I can recall going into, as an example, the Senator Hotel, and we could not even eat in the cafeteria. I can recall going in and they politely asked us to leave and don't come in without a white party to bring you in. And this was true also with the legislators. They had a tough time finding lodging, eating in certain local restaurants in the area. I had a real estate firm that had 17 agents working for me, as an example. There were housing covenants against African Americans moving into certain sectors in Sacramento.
It's very easy to discriminate against us and push us into certain areas of the city. The place where black people lived when I came to Sacramento in 1953 and 54 was Oak Park, Del Paso Heights, and if you wanted to get a new house, you had to go to a place recently established called Glen Elder. But that's where we lived. And if we wanted to move to Southland Park, East Sacramento, and places like that, you couldn't do it.
In the late 50s, Jess Unruh really insisted that there be a general civil rights statute in California, and he pushed very successfully for that.
And he had the title of Big Daddy, not because of his size, but because of his demeanor.
It's 1959, and Jesse Unruh is the clear leader of the California legislature and feels very strongly about civil rights. And Unruh has run the Democratic Party campaign on a pro-civil rights platform, and the Democrats, for the first time since the war, end up electing a supermajority in the California legislature. That is over 2/3, so that they can now pass out of the legislature any legislation they want. And we passed the Unruh Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race or national origin or color or religion in any form of public accommodations by any kind of business whatsoever. One of the broadest civil rights acts in the history of the United States.
In 1959, I worked in the Department of Employment. I was a labor market analyst, and they called me the supervisor of minority specialist programs. And as a supervisor for minority specialist programs, I came to the attention of Byron Rumford. And my expertise was research and statistics. And the director of the department, in effect, loaned me to be a part of Byron's staff during that period.
For some time, Assemblyman Gus Hawkins of Los Angeles had been trying on fair employment, and it just hadn't been working. And so Hawkins looked at that and probably said, you know, Mr. Rumford may be the right guy to push for this kind of legislation.
He and Rumford together, it's interesting, were so much alike in many of their approach to legislation, to public laws, and how they treated their constituents.
Gus Hawkins had been working on the Fair Employment Act for years, But my father was able to come in there and help Gus Hawkins, and with my father's personality, kind of move things on.
Assemblyman Rumford had a great deal of respect in the legislature, and particularly in the Assembly, where there was a lot of congeniality.
A lot of his success had to do with the fact that he was just so affable. He was friendly, outgoing, and non-threatening to people. And yet he persevered.
I watched him reach across the aisle. I saw him putting his arms around a Republican saying, we need this vote.
And that's when Byron Rumford really takes over the campaign to try to pass a comprehensive Fair Employment Practices Act in California. C.L. Dellums is the head of the Pullman Porters Union, very important union in California politics, in black politics. He knew everything about civil rights history in California. He knew everything about government in California and how government worked.
And he was the originator of the idea of Fair Employment Practices Commission. During the time that the FEPC legislation was going through Congress, we went to all 35 agencies in the state of California and counted the number of blacks who were in those offices. And they were not keeping count of people by race, And of course, Dellums, who was part of the panel hearing, he said, that's why we need an FEPC.
And that's when Byron Rumford, Augustus Hawkins down in LA, and C.L. Dellums are all lobbying for California to join New York in passing the Fair Employment Practices Act and in passing legislation to prohibit discrimination in housing and in public accommodations. And at that point, Hawkins also gets through the legislature a mild sort of Fair Housing Act in that it only applies to public housing.
In 1963, fair housing was a real hot topic, and there was great discrimination in California, and that's where Byron Rumford came in, because he was one of the early pushers for the fair housing legislation that he introduced in 1963.
Governor Pat Brown and Byron Rumford, they had a common thread that they were both committed to, and that was equal rights and ensure that all Californians had access to equal housing.
And Governor Brown, at some of his news conferences, he made it clear during the process that if it survived the legislature, he'd sign it.
During this period, the early 1960s, the demography of California is very different than it is today. According to the 1960 census, 99% of the black people in the Los Angeles region lived in segregated black neighborhoods.
And there were restrictive covenants here in Los Angeles, too. You could not live beyond Fairfax. They had a restrictive covenants in the Fairfax. And so some areas of Los Angeles, you couldn't go any further west.
And these covenants are on the contract, so when people sell their houses, those contracts explicitly spell out that exclusion and discrimination is to be practiced.
Here in the Bay Area, 1960, generally black people segregated, living in Richmond, living in Oakland, living in South Berkeley, living in 3 neighborhoods in San Francisco, all of them largely black neighborhoods.
So this Fair Housing Act came right at one of the hottest times in race relations.
California was in the spotlight. This had become a national story. Is California, supposedly a liberal state, progressive, going to take a positive action with regard to fair housing?
It's a difficult political challenge in and of itself, trying to pass fair housing where there are political risks as well as difficult challenges. You're facing an incredible lobby in forms of the California Realtors Association and others who quite frankly opposed any civil rights legislation in the 60s.
And generally, white people feel in California and across the country that they shouldn't be made to have to live next to black people. And they are unashamed about that. in Berkeley, liberal Berkeley, the city council in the winter of 1963 passes a fair housing law for Berkeley. And there's immediately a petition campaign, and they put on the ballot the repeal by the voters. Meanwhile, in the legislature, Byron Rumford is moving his bill forward against terrific opposition, and politically, they are fighting against the most powerful interests in the state.
And he was just quietly going after the goal that he had set and get it through the legislature. And it was a good debate on the floor of the Assembly from Republicans, and there was some opposition.
So April 2nd, 1963, the voters of Berkeley vote to repeal the Berkeley Fair Housing Ordinance, making segregation legal and housing discrimination legal in Berkeley. And this is perhaps the most liberal town in the state of California.
They were coming down to the deadline, and the legislature was going to adjourn, and so they felt the pressure that was mounting to get the fair housing bill through so the governor could sign it. And so time was running out.
June 21st, 1963, the last day of the legislative session, the Speaker, Jesse Unruh, and the governor agree they're just going to lock those members in the legislative house until they give them a bill. And they do so at about 11:45 that night. They pass the bill, the governor signs it, and the legislature can go home.
When the Rumford Fair Housing Act was passed here in the California legislature, it was one of the most contentious debates ever here in the legislature.
And I'm sure there was some arm twisting that went on, and there was an understanding even among a number of the conservative members of the legislature that the time was right for that, even though some of them thought this will not be popular in my district.
Now we have a Fair Housing Act in California, but in the meantime, Lincoln and Dorothy Mulkey, a young black couple living in Southern California, go looking for an apartment to rent, and they see an apartment they like that's listed in Santa Ana.
In 1963, when I was 23 years old, my husband and I decided we needed to move out of the house we were living in with his father and my mother-in-law, and we needed a place of our own.
Dottie Mulkey lived in Little Texas in Santa Ana, and that's where black people were ushered if they were looking for housing in Orange County. And that area was segregated, fairly well defined by northwest of First and Bristol and Santa Ana.
My husband and I knew of the new apartments, and they were also in the newspaper. So I got the numbers out of the newspaper, called the apartment building, made 3 appointments for the same day, and I was so excited. So day 1 we went to the first appointment, and I observed a lady peeking out from the window, and as we were approaching the door, she immediately opened it and said, "You're just too late, about 5 minutes too late. We've already rented the place." And I said, well, there were 5 apartments available. So we rented all 5 of them. Sorry. I didn't know there was a Fair Housing Act in California. What was going on politically at that time was not of interest to me. All I wanted was a new apartment for my baby.
And they bring a lawsuit under the Rumford Fair Housing Act.
They had made California the battleground for the showdown on housing legislation. There was numerous scare tactics which were used to frighten people into voting for this thing. And they felt if they could defeat this legislation here, that their chances of defeating it in other areas was very good.
A week from today, the state legislature will be gavelled into session here at the Capitol.
KCRA Channel 3 established a full-time Capitol Bureau in 1964, and I was selected to do that. And it was a tough campaign year. It was a presidential year.
1964 was a year almost as important as 63 because that was the year that Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. So this Fair Housing Act came right at one of the hottest times in race relations. And some felt it was all right to let their prejudice against black people stand out.
We had the forces that wanted to overthrow the new Rumford Fair Housing Act circulating a petition. They got the signatures necessary relatively easily, and they qualified that for the ballot that same year.
So 1964, the real estate industry puts on the ballot a proposition, Proposition 14, to repeal the Rumford Fair Housing Act. And it has the support of the Republican Party. It has the support of Barry Goldwater, who is running for president as the Republican candidate. And they run on a campaign slogan, "A man's home is his castle." And they want to write under law to segregate housing and to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. And that engenders a lot of interesting things around the state of California.
In 1964, Orange County was a hostile community to this perspective. The John Birch Society was a large and ever-present organization in Orange County at that time. And this is an ultra-conservative organization that, staunchly with the realtors of Orange County were really behind this overthrow of the Rumford Fair Housing Act.
During the early 60s, there was always a connection between the South and the Birch Society and then what we lived in Orange County. And if you're for fair housing, that was a negative in most people's minds. And people like Martin Luther King were not favored here.
It was a tough and vigorous campaign by both sides, and there was a lot of grassroots support in favor of Prop 14.
And then a lot of people were confused because we who wanted fair housing were supporting no on 14. But people thought, oh, this is 14, oh yes, this is yes on the Rumford Act. So they would vote yes, which was actually to repeal the act. And so it was confusing, and it was a very difficult time. And that's when you saw a lot of racism coming out and a lot just pouring out.
People were afraid, in particular if they were owners of apartments or owners of their own homes. Oh, what's going to happen if a black moves into my apartment? Oh, everybody else is going to move out. Then there was the fear of the homeowner. Oh, my house isn't going to be worth as much. If black people move into the neighborhood, they'll take over the whole neighborhood. So that was part of the climate.
There was a point in time that my dad approached me and said, well, I've had a lot of threats, and if something happens, I want you to take care of Mom and the family. Going to Southern California, there were times he had an escort from the California Highway Patrol to attend meetings because it was neighborhoods that were not receptive to this legislation. So there were times that got a little rough.
The Real Estate Association put a lot of money into Prop 14. They were so fearful this would destroy their control.
I remember Proposition 14 being a wedge issue, where the vitriol and the embittered view is that if you have a different view than me, you're going to taint the person as well as the issue.
It's very gratifying in anything of this character where the issue is so controversial, because it constitutes what we think is a clear mandate of how the population of this state feels, and we also feel as though in this our local board and our state association were actually representing the majority of the people.
1964 was the year that the Republican Party held its national convention in San Francisco at the Cow Palace. 1964 was the day that I was introduced to raw politics at its worst. And that is Louis Freeman, the news director for KDIA Radio, where I was working at that time, and I were both literally driven from the Republican convention by a rowdy mob of people sitting in the gallery of the Republican convention. Not their delegates, but their supporters. And it was easy with Klan's people demonstrating in San Francisco in '64 about everything, but they had the nerve to be here.
Now, one of the things that happens here in Berkeley is that students are demonstrating against Prop 14. These are some of the same students who are marching on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley at Woolworths. It's the same students who are demonstrating in Richmond against Lucky Stores because Lucky Stores won't hire black clerks for their grocery stores.
I came to Berkeley in 1962 to start my education at the University of California. And I would say that the key issues of the time were really around civil rights. And of course, Prop 14 was central to that, since it was an effort to repeal Byron Rumford's Fair Housing Act. So when we began the ad hoc committee to end discrimination, we all had our tables up on that strip of sidewalk at the corner of Bancroft and Telegraph, and had our leaflets and so forth. And that's where all the civil rights groups were, SNCC and CORE, and I was with the Du Bois Club, and we all had our tables up. So the principle upon which free speech movement was organized was not whether or not you were for or against Proposition 14, but your right to advocate for or against Proposition 14. And that's what united us. In that context, when the administration announced that we can no longer advocate for civil rights, that we can no longer advocate for change in the Bay Area, that we can no longer advocate for opposition to Proposition 14, when those things became clear to us, then we had a sense of urgency. And when we saw what one African American in the Assembly could do, which is to get so much legislation passed, including this Fair Housing Act, then, you know, the consciousness that we had was, we got to not only keep this guy in Sacramento, but we got to make sure that his legislation doesn't get defeated by popular vote. And of course, that was the start of the free speech movement. So the two struggles for no on 14 and for freedom of speech were totally intertwined.
Public opinion in California was running against the fair housing measure. The issue was out there. I mean, it was, people could, I think by election day, they could understand what the issue was. Hard to go to the polls and really not know at the time of the polling where you stood on the Prop 14.
I think that most of us who were in the thick of this fight on Proposition 14 from its very inception were confident that we were eventually going to win it. But I think very few of us would admit that we would win it by such a wide margin.
So the voters of California have overwhelmingly rejected the Fair Housing Act and voted in favor of housing discrimination and housing segregation.
You know, the victory ratio throughout the state was 2-to-1, but of all the counties in California, Orange County was 3-to-1 for Proposition 14.
So when this bill by Byron Rumford that had been signed into law by the governor of California was put to the vote, it was rejected. It was a crushing blow to many who thought we were really moving forward.
Just devastating. When you work that hard, you do what some people said couldn't be done, and to have it taken away by a vote of the people, despite the legislative victory, I think had to be very much disappointing, if not devastating, to Byron Rumford.
The day after the election, when it was clear that the Rumford thing had gone down to defeat, Sacramento Attorney Nathaniel Cawley, who was on good terms with Governor Brown, was the instigator of the legal action.
Ned Cawley was certainly Mr. Civil Rights, and he knew the law like no one else. He was highly respected in regards to his pursuit of many of these restrictions that were on the books at the time.
The NAACP, whom I represent, is preparing at this present time a suit to be filed in the state Supreme Court directing the Secretary of State and the state printer not to take any action to include Proposition 14 as a part of the state constitution.
Where will it go?
That's what started this long process through the courts, eventually going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the Mulkeys, in their lawsuit against Reitman, find themselves back in court because Reitman has gone back to court and asked the court to dismiss their case, to, in technical terms, to issue a summary judgment, because housing discrimination is now legal again. And the court agrees. And the case is dismissed, or judgment is entered against the Mulkey family.
In 1966, they reapportioned California, and they created two at-large Senate districts. And Byron Rumford, who had been representing the northern part of Alameda County since 1948, seemed to be in line to be the first black member of the state Senate.
And of course, there came the time for him to run in the state Senate, and that was the senatorial seat that was developed in Alameda County. I was in the position of running my dad's campaign, and in the primary election. When we won in June, everybody felt great. Rumford will win in November. November came, we ran our campaign, and we had some issues develop, and we kept moving.
Byron had to run in southern Alameda County. And I told Byron, you know, this Rumford Fair housing thing is still stuck in the craw of a lot of white people who were upset over it.
Many people felt that the Rumford Fair Housing Act would hurt my dad, but that wasn't the real issue. I was there. I was there on election night for the counting of the ballots early in the evening when they started coming in. And one of the people came over to me and says, "Billy, there's no way Byron's going to win tonight." And there were ballots laying in the hallway near the clerk's office that were not folded. I was there when the last truck came in at 5 a.m. with ballots. There's nowhere in Alameda County, after the polls close at 7, that you're going to come in at 5 o'clock in the morning with some ballots.
I had always a deep respect for the law. I was a lawmaker, and I felt then and feel now that anybody in high position and who has as their responsibility to enforce the laws should either enforce the law or they shouldn't be in office. Well, that's my strong position. So when I find and have had experience, which led me and leads me to believe that some of our high officers in high places, our elected officials, are shading their eyes to wrongdoings, I can't help but become disturbed. Because how can they shade their eyes in one instance where there's violations of the law to the extent that they almost participate in it, and then ask the street people to behave? I believe strongly that there was knowledge of wrongdoing at the courthouse, well known to the officials, and they shaded their eyes to it for a purpose.
None of us had the answers to why he did not win that Senate seat. He was certainly the favorite. He certainly should have won that seat, and somehow or another things did not go right.
It has been shown irregularities in the election process that took place there. So we'll never know whether he was unfairly denied being in that Senate seat or not. But there are many people who said that, you know, given everything else being equal, he was the better candidate and should have won.
The Mulkey case was the lead case against Proposition 14 to restore fair housing laws in the state of California. I joined the Fair Housing Council in 1966, and we didn't have any law behind us in order to stop discrimination. That wasn't until '67, until the Mulkey case.
Dorothy and Lincoln Mulkey proved that the landlords in Orange County at that time were systematically discriminating against African Americans, and they found help with the NAACP.
The NAACP decided that the strategy they would use would be relatively simple.
What they did is they set up a testing system. So they would send in a white couple and they would seek a rental, and then they'd get it. And then they'd send in an African-American couple afterwards with the same profile. And they'd be saying, well, I'm sorry that, there's nothing available. And then they'd send in another white couple afterwards, and the landlord would say, yeah, we've got a unit for you too.
So now we had ammunition for the NAACP to work with. It was clear cut. And that's when the plan of strategy took place. And there was no backing down. We were going full steam ahead.
And the California Supreme Court, in a very courageous ruling, says this attempt by the voters to amend the California Constitution was itself unconstitutional. You cannot first provide that there is a prohibition on racial discrimination in housing, and then rescind that and say, yes, we're going to permit such discrimination, because that's a violation of the Equality Clause of the California and the U.S. Constitution.
So Dorothy and Lincoln Mulkey were able to take this case all the way to the Supreme Court with Thurgood Marshall as part of their battery of attorneys.
Thurgood Marshall in the 1960s is a transformative figure who invents the idea of a litigation strategy to turn the NAACP from a lobbying organization and a civil rights advocacy group to the most important force in changing the law through law reform, through bringing test cases in the court. And in a 5-4 decision, majority opinion written by Justice Byron White, and Justice White agrees with the California Supreme Court, says that this is unconstitutional discrimination against black people, and the decision by the voters to repeal this law was itself unconstitutional and illegal, and the Rumford Fair Housing Act is the law of the land.
I was so proud to know Byron Rumford. He just was rock solid, man of his word, said what he was going to do, and then didn't talk about it anymore. He was just everything that you would want in a public official, going to represent you. And I don't know any other black man at that time could have passed the FEPC bills. And the record that Byron Rumford left will be forever stamped in Berkeley.
People of my age can remember when there was a solid wall in front of us and how we went about knocking it down. What Byron Rumford did do was bridge the gap to the highest levels of California government. He had the governor on his side. He had senators on his side. He could speak to his colleagues in Southern California, and because he talked softly, but as they say, carried a big stick, he could get a lot of things done.
His legislation establishing the FEPC, fair housing, 59 and 63. Those institutions still live, and they now remain one of the most significant parts of the California legislative history.
You look at people like Jackie Robinson or Martin Luther King or others that are recognized as turning the hands of civil rights and modernizing America. Byron Rumford was certainly one of those pioneers. When I was in the legislature succeeding John Miller, who succeeded Byron Rumford. One of the things that I wanted to do to recognize Byron Rumford was create a living legacy for him, and I had Highway 24 between the tunnel and 580 named the Byron Rumford Freeway to really give credit to a man who was not only a pioneer in terms of black politics, but quite frankly, a trendsetter and the person that made California face up to its racism.
The whole discussion around race and racism is very complicated now in the United States. And it's not so much that racism had disappeared for a while and has now reasserted itself, is that the racism has always been present, but there was a kind of public agreement that we were not going to express it. You can pass legislation, but you can't legislate changes in culture and attitude. That has to come through education.
The housing issue that was 50 years ago has gotten a little bit better, but not much. And those chosen few that can live wherever they want are still not welcomed there. The prejudice is still there.
As people have seen themselves slipping back, how they individually can move forward, but if the group doesn't move forward, eventually it catches up with them. So we hope we're growing some people today that are going to look back at this example, not bemoan where we haven't gone to, but work to get us there.